What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about history, about the cities beneath our feet, the cathedrals above our heads, and the civilization that built them, has been deliberately hidden from you? Imagine for a moment that there was once an advanced global society so powerful, so technologically sophisticated, that its very existence had to be buried literally under layers of mud, dirt, and lies. But what if this buried world wasn't just another lost civilization? What if it was the result of divine judgment, a direct intervention by Yahweh against a society that had fallen under the influence of the rebellious sons of God, aiming to corrupt and control humanity once again? We've all heard about mysterious lost civilizations: Atlantis, Lemuria, ancient Egypt, but the Mudflood, it's a phenomenon that has sparked endless debate and speculation across the world. Some say it was a random natural disaster, nothing more than geological processes doing what geological processes do. Others claim it was simply urban development, streets being raised over time, old buildings gradually sinking into the earth. But I'm here to tell you that the Mudflood wasn't just a geological event. It was something far deeper, something far more ancient, and something that continues to influence our world today. Think about what we're really dealing with here. Across every continent on Earth, we find buildings with their first floors buried underground, windows that were clearly designed to let in sunlight now opening into dirt, ornate doorways that once welcomed visitors now sealed beneath street level, cathedrals with entrances 10 feet below the current ground, government buildings with elaborate architectural details hidden in what we now call basements. And this isn't isolated to one city or one country. We're talking about Seattle, Boston, San Francisco, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Prague, Paris, Melbourne, cities on opposite sides of the planet, showing the exact same pattern of burial. In this video, we're going to uncover the truth about what lies beneath our cities. We're going to dig beneath the surface quite literally and explore a theory that ties this global catastrophe to one of the oldest and most dangerous conflicts in human history: the Seed War. Yes, the Seed War. A spiritual battle that began in the days of Noah, continued at the Tower of Babel, and stretches all the way to the present day. The Mudflood, I believe, was another front in this ongoing war. A war between Yahweh, the creator of all things, and the rebellious sons of God who sought to corrupt and dominate humanity. And if you think this is just another video about conspiracy theories, think again. By the time we're done, you'll see that the evidence points to something much bigger than any one theory can explain. We'll show you how the Mudflood fits into the biblical narrative of divine intervention, and how it mirrors the same kinds of spiritual judgments that led to Noah's flood, the destruction of Babel, and the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah. But even more importantly, we'll explain why this matters now, and how the legacy of this buried civilization, just like the Nephilim, continues to shape our world today through secret societies, suppressed technology, occult practices, and the ongoing deception of humanity. If you're someone who's curious about the hidden truths of history, the spiritual battle shaping our world, and the mysteries that most people are afraid to confront, then this video is for you. We're going to walk through undeniable evidence that points to the Mudflood as divine judgment, a deliberate intervention by Yahweh to stop a civilization that had become corrupted by the same fallen beings who corrupted humanity before the Genesis flood. Consider the scope of what we're examining. Entire buildings, cathedrals, and palaces, some of which are not even 200 years old, according to official narratives, are provably buried under 14 feet of soil. Entire cities on every continent, all over the world. And yet somehow, questioning this is considered fringe thinking. Somehow, noticing that the first floor of your city's oldest building is underground makes you a conspiracy theorist. But the evidence is right there, visible to anyone willing to look. Seattle's original downtown sits completely beneath the current street level. You can take tours through what used to be the main thoroughfares of the city, walking past storefronts and doorways that haven't seen natural light in over a century. The official story is that after a fire, the city simply decided to raise itself by an entire story. But think about what that actually means. Think about the logistics. Think about the engineering required. And then ask yourself why there's so little documentation of this massive undertaking. Boston's historic buildings have their original first floors buried underground. Photographs from the 1800s show these same structures, with their ground floors fully exposed, windows at street level, doors opening onto sidewalks. Today, those windows look into dirt. Those doors lead nowhere. The buildings haven't sunk. The ground has risen. But risen from what? Filled with what? And documented where? Moscow presents perhaps the most striking evidence. Photographs from the mid-1800s show the city's grand architecture standing in what appears to be a recently cleared landscape. Mud everywhere. Few people visible in the streets. The buildings look ancient and magnificent, but the surroundings look raw and unsettled, as if these structures were uncovered rather than constructed, as if the population that now inhabits them arrived after the buildings were already there. But before we dive into the evidence for what the mudflood truly was, we need to start by addressing some of the alternative explanations for these buried buildings. You've probably heard the mainstream theories. You've probably encountered the dismissive explanations that historians and architects offer when confronted with these anomalies. Natural disasters, urban development, regional flooding, lost records. Well, we're going to take those ideas head on and show you why none of these explanations hold up when you compare them to the global evidence. We're going to examine each theory systematically, applying the same rigorous standards that these theories fail to meet. Because here's what the mainstream explanations require you to believe. They require you to accept that random, unconnected events produced identical results across every continent. They require you to believe that massive infrastructure projects occurred without documentation. They require you to accept that cultural memory of catastrophic events simply vanished, while mundane details from the same era were preserved in abundance. The truth is far more disturbing than the comfortable lies we've been told. The truth points to deliberate action, coordinated burial, systematic erasure, and divine judgment. Stick with me, because over the next hour, we're going to connect the dots, expose the truth, and take you on a journey through history, prophecy, and spiritual warfare. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. By the end of this video, you'll not only understand what the mudflood was, but you'll see how this ancient judgment ties directly to the ongoing battle for humanity's future. You'll understand why certain knowledge has been suppressed. You'll understand why certain buildings were demolished while others were preserved, and you'll understand your place in the spiritual war that has been raging since the dawn of time. So, hit that like button if you're ready to dive deep into the buried history they don't want you to know. Make sure to subscribe if you want to keep uncovering hidden truths with us. And settle in, because what we're about to explore will change the way you see every old building, every historic downtown, and every official narrative you've ever been taught. Let's get started. One of the most common explanations for the buried buildings we see around the world is that they were simply victims of natural disasters. Mudslides, liquefaction, volcanic activity, seismic events. Mainstream geologists and historians will tell you there's nothing mysterious about any of this, just the normal forces of nature doing what nature has always done. Random catastrophes striking random locations at random times. But when we dive into the evidence and compare it to this theory, it becomes clear that this explanation doesn't hold up. Let me explain why. Let's begin with the most obvious problem. If natural disasters buried these buildings, why do they remain structurally intact and perfectly level? Think carefully about what happens when a mudslide hits a structure. It pushes, it tilts, it destroys. The force of moving earth doesn't gently settle around a building like snow falling on a winter landscape. It tears through walls. It shifts foundations. It leaves chaos in its wake. Look at any modern mudslide footage, and you'll see buildings torn apart, twisted, reduced to rubble. That's what natural geological forces do to human structures. Now consider the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Here we have a building that has been naturally sinking for centuries due to soft ground beneath its foundation. And what happened? It tilts, it shifts, it leans at an angle that has made it famous around the world. That's what natural geological processes do to buildings. They don't preserve them perfectly. They distort them. They damage them. They leave unmistakable evidence of the forces that acted upon them. But when we look at the buried structures across Europe, across America, across Russia and Australia, and every other continent, what do we see? Buildings standing perfectly upright, walls straight and true, foundations undisturbed, windows aligned exactly as their architects intended, just 10 feet lower than they should be, as if someone carefully poured dirt around them while they remained completely stationary, as if the burial was controlled rather than catastrophic. Now let's be real. A natural mudslide doesn't politely stop at the window line. It doesn't selectively bury the first floor while leaving the upper stories pristine and untouched. It doesn't coordinate across continents to produce the exact same burial depth in Boston, Moscow, Melbourne, and Mexico City. The precision of what we're looking at defies natural explanation. The consistency across unconnected geographic regions makes random natural disaster statistically impossible. Here's another major problem with the natural disaster theory. Where is the geological record? If a global mud event occurred in the 1800s, or even regional mud events occurring simultaneously across multiple continents, we would expect to find abundant evidence in the geological strata. This is how geology works. Events leave traces. Volcanic eruptions leave ash layers that can be dated and traced across vast distances. Tsunamis leave distinct sediment signatures in coastal areas. Major floods leave traceable deposits that geologists can identify, date, and study for generations afterward. But when we search for evidence of a worldwide mud catastrophe in the 19th century, we find nothing in mainstream geological literature, no seismic records correlating to global burial events, no volcanic markers explaining where the mud came from, no coordinated sediment layers spanning multiple continents that would indicate a single catastrophic event or series of closely timed events. The geological evidence that should exist if the natural disaster theory were true simply isn't there. Either it never existed, or it's being systematically ignored by the scientific establishment. Consider also the composition of the material itself. When researchers have examined the substance surrounding buried buildings, it doesn't always match typical flood or mudslide deposits. River floods carry organic material, specific mineral compositions, and layering patterns that tell the story of their origin. Mudslides leave characteristic debris fields with identifiable source materials, but the fill around many buried structures lacks these telltale signatures. Whatever buried these buildings wasn't ordinary mud carried by ordinary geological processes. And then there's the human response to consider, or rather, the complete absence of human response. When natural disasters strike, people document them. They write about them in newspapers and journals. They memorialize the victims with monuments and annual observances. They pass down stories to their children and grandchildren. The trauma becomes part of the cultural fabric. The 1889 Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania killed over 2,000 people and devastated an entire region. We have extensive documentation of that event. Photographs taken in the immediate aftermath. Newspaper articles from across the country describing the horror. Survivor testimonies recorded for posterity. Memorial sites that still stand today, more than a century later. The Johnstown flood is seared into American historical memory because that's what happens when catastrophic events occur. People remember, people record, people memorialize. So where are the equivalent records for the disasters that supposedly buried the first floors of buildings across the civilized world? Where are the newspaper articles describing the Great Mud Catastrophe of 1840 or 1850 or 1860? Where are the survivor accounts passed down through families? Where are the memorials to the thousands or millions who must have perished in events large enough to bury entire city districts under 10 to 15 feet of earth? The silence is deafening, and that silence tells us something critically important. Either these events never happened the way mainstream explanations suggest, or the records of what truly occurred have been deliberately suppressed. There is no third option. Natural disasters of this magnitude don't happen without leaving both geological and historical traces. The absence of both types of evidence points to something other than natural disaster. Genesis 7:11 tells us that during Noah's flood, the fountains of the great deep were broken up and the windows of heaven were opened. Scripture shows us that when Yahweh judges a civilization, the evidence is unmistakable and the memory endures for generations. The flood of Noah is remembered by cultures around the world. Babel's destruction scattered humanity, but didn't erase the memory of what happened there. Sodom and Gomorrah's annihilation is recorded not just in Scripture, but in the very geography of the region where they once stood. But with the mudflood, we have physical evidence of burial without any corresponding historical memory. We have buildings underground without any cultural recollection of how they got there. We have cities built on top of cities with no explanation for the transition. That's not natural disaster. That's coordinated erasure. That's evidence being buried along with the buildings themselves. The natural geological event theory requires us to believe in a series of impossible coincidences. Random, unconnected events somehow producing identical results across every inhabited continent. Catastrophic forces somehow preserving the very structures they should have destroyed. Massive disasters somehow occurring without leaving geological traces or historical records. This isn't science. This is wishful thinking dressed up in scientific language. It's a comfortable explanation designed to avoid the much harder questions about what really happened and why. Natural disasters don't coordinate across oceans. They don't selectively preserve architecture while burying it, and they don't occur without leaving the geological and historical evidence that every other natural disaster in recorded history has left behind. Now, let's address another popular explanation, the idea that these basement windows and buried floors are simply normal architectural features, the natural result of gradual urban development and changing street levels over time. Mainstream historians and architects have a ready answer when you ask about buried first floors and basement windows at street level. They'll tell you it's simply the result of gradual urban development. Cities grow, streets get raised, new construction covers old construction. Filled dirt accumulates over decades and centuries. Nothing mysterious about it, just the normal evolution of urban landscapes over time. But when we examine this explanation against the actual evidence, it crumbles under the slightest scrutiny. Here's the first problem, and it's a significant one. If buried floors are just normal urban development, why does the exact same pattern appear in cities that developed completely independently of each other? Moscow had no connection to Boston in the 1800s. San Francisco's city planners weren't consulting with their counterparts in Istanbul. Prague and Melbourne followed entirely different developmental trajectories, separated by thousands of miles and completely different cultural contexts. Yet when we examine the architecture of these cities, we find the identical phenomenon. First floors buried, windows at ground level that were clearly designed to be above ground, ornate doorways now opening into solid earth. The consistency across unconnected cultures and continents cannot be explained by independent urban development decisions. Different cities facing different challenges with different resources and different planning philosophies somehow arrived at the exact same outcome, the exact same burial depth, the exact same architectural anomalies. This isn't coincidence. This is pattern, and patterns demand explanation. The second problem is even more damning for the urban development theory. If streets were gradually raised over time, burying the lower floors of existing buildings, there should be extensive documentation of these massive infrastructure projects. We're not talking about minor adjustments here. We're talking about raising the ground level of entire city districts by 10, 12, sometimes 15 feet. Think about what that actually requires. Engineering plans, city council approvals, budget allocations, contractor bids, labor records, material sourcing, transportation logistics, newspaper coverage, public debate. Where are these documents? In Chattanooga, Tennessee, city records indicate that streets were raised between 1875 and 1905. But the records don't explain why this was necessary. They don't detail where the enormous quantities of fill material came from. They don't describe the engineering challenges or the public response. They simply acknowledge that something happened without providing the documentation that such a massive undertaking would have generated. The same pattern repeats across cities worldwide. Vague acknowledgements that ground levels changed, but no detailed explanation of the cause, the process, or the purpose. Consider Prague for a moment. The official narrative claims that people poured 7 meters of dirt over the entire city centre sometime in the medieval period. 7 meters. That's nearly 23 feet of fill material covering one of Europe's great cities. Let's actually think about what that means. Where did this material come from? Prague isn't situated near mountains that could provide unlimited fill. How was it transported? Medieval technology didn't include dump trucks and conveyor belts. How long would such an undertaking require? How many workers? How much cost? And most importantly, why would an entire population voluntarily bury their own city? What possible motivation could drive such an enormous project? The official story provides no answers, because the official story makes no sense. The logistics alone render it implausible. The complete absence of detailed documentation renders it suspicious. But perhaps the most revealing evidence comes from the architecture itself. Look closely at the windows and doorways that now sit at or below ground level. These aren't utilitarian basement features designed to be underground from the start. They're ornate, decorated, crafted with the same meticulous attention to detail as the visible upper floors. Stone carvings surround windows that now face dirt. Elaborate moldings frame doorways that lead nowhere. Stained glass filters light that no longer reaches these buried spaces. Why would architects design beautiful, ornate windows intended to be buried underground? Why would master craftsmen spend months carving intricate stonework around doorways that would never be seen by human eyes? Why would builders install expensive stained glass in spaces destined to be filled with earth? The answer is straightforward. They wouldn't. No rational builder wastes resources on decoration that will never be seen. These features were designed to be visible. They were designed to be above ground. They were designed to welcome visitors and display craftsmanship to anyone who approached. They were buried later. The buildings affected by this phenomenon aren't limited to dense urban centers where the street-raising explanation might at least seem plausible. Rural structures and isolated cathedrals show the same burial pattern. Country churches in the English countryside have their original entrances underground. Estates far from any city centre display the same architectural anomalies. These aren't locations where street levels needed to be raised for urban planning purposes. There's no infrastructure justification for burying a rural chapel up to its windows. There's no municipal need to raise the ground level around an isolated country manor. Yet the burial pattern persists in these locations, just as it does in major cities. The same depth, the same precision, the same ornate features now hidden underground. Urban development theory cannot explain rural burial. The explanation fails where it should succeed most easily. And then there's the question of timing. If this were truly gradual urban development occurring over decades or centuries, we would expect to see variation. Some buildings buried deeper because they're older. Others barely affected because they're more recent. A gradual gradient reflecting the slow accumulation of fill over time. But that's not what we find. Buildings from supposedly different eras show the same burial depth. Structures that official history dates to different centuries display identical patterns. The uniformity suggests a single event or a concentrated series of events rather than gradual accumulation. Isaiah 29:15 warns of those who seek deep to hide their counsel from the Lord and whose works are in the dark. The gradual urban development theory asks us to accept that cities around the world independently decided to bury their finest architecture for reasons that were never clearly documented, using methods that were never properly explained, with materials that came from sources that remain unidentified to this day. This isn't historical explanation. This is historical obfuscation. This is a comfortable story designed to prevent harder questions from being asked. Gradual urban development doesn't produce globally consistent architectural anomalies spanning every inhabited continent. It doesn't bury rural buildings with the same precision as urban ones. It doesn't occur without generating the documentation that major infrastructure projects always generate. Something else happened here. Something that required explanation. Something that was systematically obscured from the historical record. Perhaps you've heard yet another theory to explain these anomalies. Some argue that what we're seeing is simply evidence of regional floods affecting different areas at different times, unrelated local events that just happen to look similar when viewed from a distance. Let's examine why this explanation also fails to account for what we're observing. Some will argue that what we're seeing across the world is simply evidence of regional floods. The Mississippi River overflowing its banks and depositing sediment across the American heartland. European rivers breaking their boundaries during particularly harsh seasons. Asian monsoons dumping unprecedented rainfall and washing mud across lowland cities. Unrelated local events that just happen to look similar when viewed together across time and geography. But when we really dig into this explanation and compare it to what we know from the evidence, the theory falls apart completely. Local floods don't produce uniform burial depths across multiple continents. This is perhaps the most fundamental problem with the regional flood explanation. When a river floods, it deposits sediment unevenly. Areas closest to the water source receive the heaviest deposits. The sediment thins and disperses as you move away from the flood's origin point. We can observe this phenomenon in any modern flood event. The pattern is predictable. The distribution follows clear hydrological principles. This is basic geology that any undergraduate student learns in their first year of study. But the buried buildings we're examining don't follow this pattern at all. They show consistent burial depths regardless of their proximity to water sources. A building in landlocked Denver, Colorado, sitting a mile above sea level in the interior of a continent, shows the same burial depth as a building in coastal San Francisco. A structure in the mountains displays the same phenomenon as one in a river valley. The uniformity defies the uneven distribution that local floods always produce. If regional flooding were responsible, we would see dramatic variation in burial depths based on distance from water sources. We don't see that variation. We see consistency. Here's another critical point that the localized flood theory cannot address. River floods leave distinct sediment signatures that geologists can identify and trace. They contain specific organic materials. They display characteristic mineral compositions based on the river's watershed. They create layering patterns that tell the story of their origin, their force, and their duration. A trained geologist can look at flood sediments and determine not only that a flood occurred, but often which river system produced it, and approximately when the event took place. But when researchers have examined the material surrounding buried buildings in various locations, it frequently doesn't match typical river flood deposits. The composition is wrong. The layering is wrong. The organic content doesn't align with what local water sources would have carried. Whatever buried these structures wasn't normal floodwater depositing normal sediments through normal hydrological processes. Something else was at work. The timing presents another insurmountable problem for those who want to believe in unconnected regional floods. Buildings from St. Petersburg to San Francisco, from Moscow to Melbourne, from Prague to Philadelphia, all show evidence of burial occurring within the same general historical window, the mid to late 19th century. If these were truly independent regional floods happening at different times in different places for different reasons, we would expect to see a wider range of burial dates. Some buildings buried in the 1700s, others in the early 1800s, still others in the late 1800s or early 1900s, a scattered distribution reflecting random, unconnected events. Instead, we see synchronization, we see coordination, we see a pattern that suggests either a single global event or a series of closely timed events, rather than random regional occurrences spread across decades or centuries. The timing is too precise to be coincidental. And what about the landlocked cities? This is where the regional flood theory becomes truly untenable. Kazan sits in the interior of Russia, far from any major body of water capable of producing catastrophic flooding. Denver occupies a high plateau surrounded by mountains, isolated from any river system that could generate city-burying floods. Parts of Central Australia show the same burial patterns despite being among the driest landscapes on Earth. Yet all of these locations display the same architectural anomalies as coastal cities and river valley settlements. Local floods can't reach places that have no local water sources capable of flooding. This is self-evident. You cannot have a river flood without a river. You cannot have coastal flooding without a coast. Yet the burial pattern persists in locations where regional flooding is geographically impossible. The theory fails precisely where it should be easiest to verify. Perhaps most telling is the absence of cultural memory. Every major flood in recorded history has left behind stories, monuments, survivor accounts, and generational trauma. The Great Flood of 1862 devastated California's Central Valley, and we have extensive documentation. Newspaper accounts describe the destruction in vivid detail. Survivors passed their experiences down to their children and grandchildren. The event became part of California's historical identity. The 1887 Yellow River flood in China killed an estimated 1 to 2 million people and generated records that historians still study today. The 1889 Johnstown flood, which we discussed earlier, left behind photographs, testimonies, memorials, and annual commemorations that continue more than a century later. This is what floods do. They traumatize communities. They generate documentation. They create lasting cultural memories that persist across generations. But where are the equivalent records for the floods that supposedly buried entire city blocks across the civilized world? Where are The newspaper articles from Boston describing the Great Flood that put the first floors of downtown buildings underground. Where are the survivor testimonies from Moscow detailing their escape from the mud that swallowed their streets? Where are the memorials in Prague honoring those who perished when 7 meters of earth allegedly covered their city? The cultural memory that should exist is entirely absent. The documentation that every other flood has generated simply isn't there. The trauma that should have been passed down through families has vanished without a trace. 2 Peter 3, sub 5-6 speaks of a world that was destroyed, being flooded with water. Scripture shows us that when God sends judgment through water, the memory persists. Noah's flood is remembered by cultures around the world. Nearly every ancient civilization has flood narratives that echo the Genesis account. The memory of divine judgment through water is embedded in humanity's collective consciousness. But the mudflood has no such cultural memory. No flood myths from the 1800s. No generational trauma passed down through families. No monuments to the victims. No annual commemorations. No newspaper archives. No survivor testimonies. Either these floods never happened the way regional flood theory suggests, or the memory itself was systematically erased along with the physical evidence. Local floods don't coordinate across oceans. They don't selectively target first floors while leaving everything else intact. They don't produce uniform burial depths in landlocked cities far from any water source. And they don't occur without leaving the cultural and historical records that every other major flood in human history has produced. The absence of evidence isn't proof of nothing, it's proof of erasure, which brings us to the final mainstream explanation we need to address. The claim that missing documentation about the mudflood is simply due to normal historical record loss, accidental destruction, and the natural degradation of archives over time, rather than any deliberate suppression of evidence. Skeptics have one final refuge when confronted with the evidence we've been examining. They'll tell you that gaps in the historical record are perfectly normal. Nothing sinister about missing documents. Records get lost all the time. Papers decay. Libraries burn down. Governments change and old archives fall into neglect. This is simply the nature of history, they say. We can't expect perfect preservation across centuries. The absence of documentation about the mudflood is just an unfortunate gap in our knowledge, nothing more. But here's the thing. The pattern of what's missing and what remains reveals something far more intentional than simple neglect or accidental loss. Records from the same era exist in remarkable abundance for countless other subjects. We have detailed documentation of political events from the 19th century, business transactions meticulously recorded in ledgers that survive to this day, social movements chronicled in newspapers, pamphlets, and personal correspondence, technological developments traced through patents, engineering journals, and manufacturing records, fashion trends, dietary habits, entertainment preferences, literary discussions. The mundane details of daily life in the 1800s are preserved in archives around the world with extraordinary completeness. Historians can tell you what people ate for breakfast in 1850s London. They can describe the fashions worn at balls in St. Petersburg. They can reconstruct the social dynamics of frontier towns in the American West. The 19th century is one of the most thoroughly documented eras in human history. Photography had emerged. Literacy rates were climbing. Newspapers proliferated. The mechanisms for recording and preserving information had reached unprecedented sophistication. Yet when it comes to the construction of the grand buildings that supposedly defined that era, the records become strangely sparse. We're told that magnificent structures rivaling ancient Rome were built in a matter of months or years. Massive cathedrals, elaborate government buildings, palatial mansions, exhibition halls spanning acres, all allegedly constructed using 19th century technology, 19th century labor, 19th century materials. Where are the construction photographs? Early photography existed. It was used to document everything from family portraits to battlefield casualties to street scenes. But comprehensive photographic records of major construction projects are remarkably scarce. We have images of completed buildings. We have images of buildings in use. But the actual process of construction, the scaffolding and the workers and the heavy equipment and the gradual rising of walls, this documentation is conspicuously absent for many of the era's most impressive structures. Where are the detailed architectural plans? Where are the contractor bids and labor records? Where are the material sourcing documents that would tell us where the stone came from and how it was transported? Where are the engineering calculations that would explain how these massive undertakings were accomplished with the technology supposedly available? Consider the maps. This is perhaps the most striking evidence of deliberate erasure rather than accidental loss. From the 1500s through the 1700s, cartographers across Europe consistently depicted a vast empire called Tartaria, spanning much of Eurasia. Abraham Ortelius included it prominently in his famous 1570 atlas, one of the most respected cartographic works of its era. Gerard Mercator showed it on his maps. French cartographers depicted it. English mapmakers acknowledged it. Map after map after map shows Tartaria as a major civilization with defined borders, significant cities, and extensive territory. By the mid-1800s, Tartaria has vanished from cartography entirely, gone, replaced by Russia, Mongolia, China, and other nations that expanded to fill the space where Tartaria once appeared, as if an entire empire was simply erased from the world's geographic awareness. This wasn't gradual evolution of knowledge. Cartographers didn't slowly refine their understanding of the region. One generation's maps showed Tartaria. The next generation's maps showed something else entirely. The transition was abrupt. The erasure was complete. A 1957 CIA declassified document actually references this erasure, noting the deletion of Tartaria's history by communist forces during their consolidation of power in the region. Even government intelligence agencies have acknowledged in their own classified communications that this civilization was deliberately scrubbed from the historical record. How many so-called conspiracy theories come with government documentation confirming the conspiracy's existence? The World's Fairs present another glaring anomaly that the accidental loss theory cannot explain. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair allegedly saw over 200 massive neoclassical buildings constructed in under 2 years. The White City, as it was called, featured architecture that rivaled ancient Greece and Rome in its grandeur and sophistication. Detailed planning documents exist for this event. Financial records exist. Promotional materials exist in abundance. Newspaper coverage was extensive. But comprehensive construction photographs showing these buildings actually being erected from foundation to completion, those are remarkably scarce. We have images of completed structures gleaming in the lakefront sun. We have images of crowds enjoying the finished fairgrounds. But the process by which 200 massive buildings rose from empty land in less than 24 months remains largely undocumented. For an event of such magnitude in an era of rising photographic documentation, the absence is suspicious. And then there are the fires. Suspicious fires destroyed major archives throughout the 19th century with remarkable consistency across nations and continents. Collections that might have contained records of the pre-Mudflood world went up in flames. The Library of Congress suffered a devastating fire in 1851, destroying thousands of irreplaceable documents. Libraries in Europe experienced similar tragedies. Archives in Russia, collections in Asia. The pattern of loss isn't random, it's targeted. It mirrors the deliberate destruction we see throughout history when powers want to control the narrative. Much like the ancient burning of the Library of Alexandria, which eliminated countless texts from civilizations deemed inconvenient to emerging powers, the archive fires of the 19th century appear designed to eliminate evidence. The difference is that Alexandria's destruction is acknowledged as deliberate. The 19th century fires are dismissed as unfortunate accidents, convenient accidents that just happened to destroy the records that would answer this whole questions we're asking today. Daniel 7:25 speaks of one who would think to change times and laws. Ecclesiastes 1:11 warns that there's no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come. The historical record hasn't simply degraded through natural neglect. It has been actively manipulated. Entire civilizations have been removed from maps. Construction histories have been obscured. Archives have been conveniently destroyed. And what remains has been carefully curated to tell a specific story, one that doesn't include the truth about what was buried beneath our feet. Accidental record loss doesn't produce globally consistent patterns of erasure spanning every continent and every major archive. Accidents don't selectively remove evidence of an entire civilization while preserving trivial details from the same period in immaculate condition. What we're looking at isn't negligence or bad luck or the natural decay of old documents. This is systematic suppression. This is coordinated erasure. This is evidence being buried just as deliberately as the buildings themselves were buried. So now that we've addressed what the mudflood is not, now that we've examined and rejected the mainstream explanations that cannot account for the evidence before us, let's examine what it truly was. And I believe the answer connects directly to the oldest and most consequential spiritual conflict in human history. What was the mudflood really? As we've already established, it wasn't a random natural disaster. It wasn't gradual urban development burying old buildings under filled earth. It wasn't a series of unrelated regional floods that just happened to produce identical results across every continent. And the missing records aren't the result of accidental loss or natural decay. I believe the mudflood was another act of divine intervention, Yahweh stepping in once again to stop a civilization that had become corrupted by the rebellious sons of God, just as he sent the flood in Noah's day to cleanse the earth of the Nephilim's corruption, just as he scattered humanity at Babel to prevent their unified rebellion against heaven, just as he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah with fire when their wickedness reached its fullness, so too did he send the mudflood to bury a civilization that had fallen under the influence of these same fallen spiritual beings. This wasn't just a geological event. This was a spiritual reset, another front in the seed war that has been raging since the serpent first whispered to Eve in the garden. The ongoing battle between Yahweh, the creator of all things, and the rebellious entities who have sought since the beginning of time to corrupt, control, and ultimately destroy humanity. The civilization buried beneath our feet wasn't just technologically advanced, it was spiritually compromised. It had aligned itself with the same fallen beings who corrupted the antediluvian world. It had embraced the same forbidden knowledge that the Watchers brought down from heaven. It had constructed the same kinds of monuments to spiritual rebellion that we see at Babel, at Baalbek, at every other site where Nephilim influence left its unmistakable mark. And like those civilizations before it, Yahweh intervened, not to destroy humanity, but to stop the corruption before it became total, not to punish the innocent, but to reset the board before the rebellious sons of God could achieve their ultimate objective. Now let's break down the evidence that points to this conclusion. We'll connect the dots and provide clear examples that show how the Mudflood civilization fits into this ancient spiritual war. Just like Babel, Canaan, and other Nephilim strongholds before it. The patterns are unmistakable, the parallels are undeniable, and once you see them, you'll never look at the buried buildings beneath your city the same way again. Let's begin with the architecture, because what we find beneath our cities isn't just impressive for its time. It's eerily similar to the kinds of structures built by civilizations that Scripture tells us were influenced by the rebellious sons of God. The buried architecture of the pre-Mudflood world shares remarkable characteristics with known Nephilim-influenced construction sites throughout history. The scale is massive. The precision is inexplicable by conventional means. The engineering knowledge required exceeds what we're told civilizations of that era possessed. Here are 4 specific examples that make this connection undeniable. First, let's examine Seattle's underground district. Seattle's entire original downtown sits buried beneath the current street level, accessible today only through guided tours that lead visitors into what was once the main commercial district of a thriving city. The official story is that after a devastating fire in 1889, city planners decided to raise the street level by 1 to 2 stories to improve drainage and sanitation. They allegedly filled in the streets, built new sidewalks at the higher elevation, and simply abandoned the original ground floors of buildings that remained intact beneath the new surface. But consider what this actually means. The buildings below weren't destroyed by the fire. They survived. Their walls stand straight and true to this day. Their architectural details remain intact. Glass still sits in some window frames. Doorways still open onto what were once busy sidewalks. These structures weren't damaged and buried. They were preserved and buried. The difference matters enormously. Throughout Scripture, we see Nephilim-influenced civilizations building structures of such magnitude and durability that they couldn't be destroyed, only abandoned or buried. The megalithic foundations at Baalbek, the massive stone constructions throughout Canaan that the Israelites encountered, the tower at Babel itself. The pattern is consistent. Supernatural knowledge produces supernatural durability. Seattle's underground displays exactly this characteristic. Buildings that should have been demolished by fire flood, or time stand preserved beneath the modern city, waiting to be rediscovered. Second, consider the cathedrals of Europe, across the continent, from France to Russia, from Spain to Scandinavia. Ancient cathedrals display the same burial pattern we see in secular buildings. Their original entrances sit below current ground level. Windows designed to flood interiors with light now face dirt and stone. Elaborate architectural details that were clearly meant to be seen and admired are hidden underground, accessible only through excavation. Notre Dame in Paris, the ancient churches of Prague, the cathedrals of St. Petersburg, all show evidence of burial that official history struggles to explain. The craftsmanship on these underground features matches or exceeds the visible architecture above. Stained glass, carved stonework, ornate metalwork, resources that no rational builder would invest in features destined to be hidden from view. These weren't basements designed for storage or utility. They were primary facades designed for worship and public assembly. The ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia were built to connect earth with the heavens, and the temples that housed them were designed to channel spiritual energy through their construction. European cathedrals display the same intentionality. Their burial wasn't gradual accumulation. It was deliberate concealment of structures built for purposes that the post-Mudflood authorities wanted forgotten. Third, we have Boston's buried first floors. Historic photographs from the 19th century show Boston's grand buildings with their ground floors fully exposed and operational. Doors opening onto sidewalks, windows at eye level, architectural details visible to any passerby. Compare these photographs to the same buildings today, and you'll find those ground floors are now underground. The doors lead into dirt. The windows illuminate nothing but earth and stone. The official explanation is filled dirt accumulated over time through urban development. But the photographs provide timestamps that contradict this gradual narrative. Buildings that appear fully exposed in 1850 are partially buried by 1880. The transformation occurred within a single generation, not across centuries of slow accumulation. The engineering sophistication of these buried structures also demands explanation. The stonework, the precise measurements, the load-bearing calculations that allowed buildings to stand for decades underground without collapsing. This is Nephilim-level construction, knowledge beyond what conventional history tells us 19th century builders possessed. The parallels to ancient sites where giant beings allegedly taught humanity the secrets of construction are impossible to ignore. Finally, examine the photographic evidence from Moscow and St. Petersburg. Images from the mid-1800s show these cities' magnificent architecture standing in landscapes that appear recently devastated. Mud everywhere, streets barely passable, grand buildings rising from what looks like a construction site or disaster zone rather than an established urban center. The people in these photographs, when they appear at all, seem out of place. Poorly dressed populations standing before palatial structures, horse-drawn carts navigating muddy paths between marble columns. The contrast is jarring. The buildings look ancient and magnificent. The surroundings look raw and unsettled, as if the structures were uncovered rather than constructed, as if the populations that now inhabit them arrived after the buildings were already there, rather than building them themselves. This pattern matches exactly what we would expect to find in the aftermath of divine judgment. Canaan after the conquest, Egypt after the plagues. civilizations that had aligned themselves with rebellious spiritual forces, judged by Yahweh, their populations removed or destroyed, their monuments left standing as silent testimony to powers that once seemed invincible. These aren't random architectural anomalies scattered across unconnected regions. They represent a global pattern of burial, a coordinated reset of a civilization that had become corrupted by spiritual forces older than recorded history. The construction techniques mirror known Nephilim sites. The burial pattern suggests deliberate concealment rather than natural catastrophe. The survival of structures that should have been destroyed points to supernatural durability that defies conventional engineering. And the architecture is just the beginning of the evidence. Next, we need to examine the world's fairs of the 19th and early 20th centuries, because the official narrative of these so-called temporary exhibitions represents one of the most audacious deceptions in modern history. The world's fairs of the late 19th and early 20th centuries present some of the most damning evidence for the Mudflood cover-up. We're told that these massive ornate complexes were constructed in just a few years using 19th century technology, horse-drawn carts, and manual labor. Then, after a few months of exhibitions, these architectural marvels were demolished, torn down, erased from the landscape as if they never existed. But when we examine the evidence carefully, the official narrative collapses under the weight of its own impossibility. Let me walk you through 4 examples that expose this deception. First, the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, the Columbian Exposition, the White City. According to official history, over 200 massive neoclassical buildings were constructed on Chicago's lakefront in approximately 2 years. The structures featured elaborate columns, intricate sculptures, massive domes, and architectural details that rivaled ancient Rome and Greece in their sophistication. Frederick Law Olmsted designed the grounds. Daniel Burnham coordinated the construction, and somehow, using horses and hand tools and 19th century logistics, they created one of the most impressive architectural complexes the world had ever seen. Then they demolished almost all of it immediately after the fair ended. Think about what this narrative actually requires you to believe. 200 buildings of classical magnificence constructed in 24 months. That's roughly 8 buildings completed every month, each one featuring stonework, sculpture, and engineering that would challenge modern construction companies with access to cranes, trucks, and power tools. No detailed construction photographs exist showing these buildings being erected from foundation to completion. We have images of completed structures. We have images of crowds enjoying the finished fairgrounds. But the actual construction process remains largely undocumented, despite the era's enthusiasm for photographic documentation. The ziggurats of ancient Mesopotamia were built as gateways between earth and heaven. Temporary structures in the eternal sense, but permanent in human terms. The White City displays the same architectural intentionality. These weren't exhibition halls hastily assembled from plaster and wood. These were monuments built to last, monuments with purposes beyond entertainment, monuments that had to be destroyed once the cover story had been established. Second, consider the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. The fair featured the Tower of Jewels, a 400-foot structure studded with over 100,000 cut glass gems that sparkled in the California sunlight. Surrounding it were palaces of unprecedented grandeur: the Palace of Fine Arts, the Palace of Machinery, the Palace of Horticulture, each one an architectural masterpiece supposedly constructed in under 3 years, and then demolished when the fair concluded. We're told these buildings were temporary structures built of plaster, wood, and staff, a mixture of plight and hemp fibers, temporary materials for temporary purposes. But the photographs tell a different story. The structures appear solid, permanent, built to endure centuries, not months. The Palace of Fine Arts was so beloved that San Franciscans demanded its preservation. It still stands today, though officially rebuilt in permanent materials in the 1960s. Or was it simply never demolished in the first place? Was the rebuilding narrative another layer of deception to explain why a supposedly temporary structure remained standing decade after decade? Third, the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair, the Louisiana Purchase Exposition. This fair featured the largest dome in America at that time, exhibition halls covering acres of ground, and engineering marvels that drew visitors from around the world, all allegedly constructed in 3 years, all allegedly demolished when the fair ended. The Brazilian pavilion presents a particularly interesting case. After the fair, it was supposedly shipped to Rio de Janeiro and rebuilt there, where it served as the seat of the Brazilian Congress for decades. Think about the logistics this story requires. A massive building disassembled piece by piece, shipped across an ocean, and reassembled in South America in the early 20th century, using the transportation technology of that era. The more likely explanation is that the building always existed in Rio de Janeiro, and the World's Fair story provided convenient cover for structures that needed historical explanations. Finally, examine the 1900 Paris Exposition Universelle. This fair introduced the world to wonders including the first moving sidewalks and the Grand Palais, a massive exhibition hall with an iron, steel, and glass structure that remains one of Paris's most impressive buildings. But here's what's interesting. The Grand Palais wasn't demolished. Neither was the Petit Palais across the avenue. These supposedly temporary exhibition buildings remained standing more than a century later. Why were some buildings demolished while others were preserved? The inconsistency reveals the deception. If all World's Fair buildings were truly temporary structures built for short-term exhibition purposes, all of them would have been demolished. The selective preservation of some structures while others were destroyed suggests different criteria at work. Buildings that could be explained within the new historical narrative were allowed to stand. Buildings that raised too many questions had to be eliminated. The World's Fairs weren't celebrations of human ingenuity and progress. They were cover operations, opportunities to showcase the remnants of a pre-Mudflood civilization, establish false construction narratives, and then demolish the evidence before too many questions could be asked. The architectural sophistication displayed at these events wasn't 19th century achievement. It was Nephilim-influenced construction being passed off as temporary exhibition under carefully controlled conditions. But the architecture holds even darker secrets than false origin stories. The buildings that survived and many that were destroyed appear to have been designed for purposes far beyond shelter or exhibition. They were energy infrastructure, built to harness forces that modern science refuses to acknowledge. One of the most suppressed aspects of the pre-Mudflood civilization is its technology, specifically its ability to harness free wireless energy from the atmosphere and the Earth itself. This wasn't just impressive architecture designed for aesthetic purposes. This was functional infrastructure built to extract, transmit, and distribute power on a global scale. And the forces that emerged after the Mudflood reset have been systematically suppressing this technology ever since. Here are 4 examples that reveal the scope of what was lost and deliberately hidden. First, examine the cathedral, domes and spires that dominate the skylines of European cities. Look at them with fresh eyes. Really look. These structures feature copper-tipped spires reaching toward the heavens, massive domes covered in metal, elaborate antenna-like protrusions that serve no obvious decorative purpose. The official explanation is that these features are purely aesthetic, expressions of religious devotion reaching toward God. But the proportions tell a different story. The mathematical ratios of these structures match precisely with wireless energy transmission designs that Nikola Tesla would later develop in his famous Wardenclyffe Tower. The height-to-width ratios, the dome curvatures, the placement of metallic elements. Either 19th and 20th century engineers independently discovered the same mathematical principles that ancient cathedral builders used, or those cathedral builders understood something about energy transmission that was later suppressed and had to be rediscovered. First, Enoch describes the Watchers teaching humanity forbidden knowledge before the flood, the secrets of metallurgy, the movements of the heavens, technologies that humanity wasn't ready to possess. Cathedral architecture bears the fingerprint of that forbidden knowledge. These weren't just houses of worship. They were receivers, collectors, nodes in a global energy distribution network that predated anything our current civilization has achieved. Second, consider Nikola Tesla himself. The official narrative presents Tesla as a genius inventor who discovered the principles of alternating current and wireless energy transmission through his own brilliance. But Tesla's own writings suggest something different. He spoke of receiving visions and downloads of complete technological systems. He described his designs as recoveries rather than inventions, as if he was accessing knowledge that already existed rather than creating something new. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower, designed to transmit wireless electricity around the world, was never completed. His funding was pulled. His laboratory was seized. His papers were confiscated by the government after his death in 1943 and have never been fully released. The pattern is unmistakable. Tesla wasn't inventing new technology. He was recovering old technology, technology that the powers controlling the post-Mudflood world couldn't allow to resurface, technology that threatened their control over energy, production, and distribution. The suppression of Tesla's work mirrors the suppression of the pre-Mudflood civilization itself. Hide the evidence, control the narrative, ensure that humanity remains dependent on systems that can be metered, monitored, and profited from. Third, look at the red and white striped towers that appear in old photographs from around the world. Today, we're told these structures were lighthouses, smokestacks, or decorative architectural features. But their distribution pattern makes no sense for any of those purposes. Landlocked cities had them. Areas with no maritime traffic had them. Locations where smokestacks served no industrial purpose had them. Mudflood researchers have identified these towers as power stations in the pre-reset energy grid. The striped pattern may have served a functional purpose related to electromagnetic field generation. The placement of these towers at regular intervals across inhabited regions suggests systematic infrastructure rather than random architectural choices. Many of these structures have been demolished, repurposed, or disguised over the past century, but enough photographic evidence survives to reveal the pattern. The red and white color coding may have indicated different functions within the energy network, different frequencies, different distribution purposes. We can't know for certain because the knowledge was deliberately suppressed along with the technology itself. Finally, examine historical accounts and surviving evidence of mercury rotating mechanisms within the domes of major buildings. Historical records describe domes containing pools of mercury that rotated continuously through mechanisms that have never been adequately explained. Official narratives dismiss these as decorative fountains or bizarre curiosities of earlier eras. But mercury rotation creates electromagnetic fields. Spinning mercury generates electrical current through principles that modern physics acknowledges but rarely applies. These dome mechanisms weren't decoration. They were generators, power sources operating on principles that predate modern electrical engineering by centuries, possibly by millennia. The Watchers of First Enoch are described teaching humanity the secrets of enchantment and the cutting of roots. These cryptic descriptions may refer to technologies we're only beginning to understand. Technologies involving resonance, frequency, and the manipulation of electromagnetic forces through architectural design and material science. The pre-Mudflood civilization had access to free energy, wireless transmission, global distribution networks that made power available to anyone, anywhere, without meters or bills or corporate control. This technology represented a threat to every power structure that emerged after the reset. If energy is free, control becomes impossible. If power flows to everyone equally, hierarchies collapse. The suppression of free energy technology wasn't just about profit. It was about maintaining the systems of control that the rebellious sons of God have always used to dominate humanity. Tesla glimpsed this technology and was destroyed. The pre-Mudflood civilization built this technology into their very architecture and was buried. The pattern of suppression continues to this day, with every inventor who threatens the energy monopoly meeting mysterious obstacles or untimely ends. But the energy infrastructure extended beyond individual buildings. It operated on a global scale through a network of geometric structures that mainstream historians dismiss as primitive military fortifications. These were the star forts, and their true purpose has been hidden in plain sight. Across every inhabited continent on Earth, we find massive geometric structures that mainstream historians call star forts or bastion forts. Perfect polygons with radiating points, symmetrical layouts that required precise mathematical knowledge to design and execute. Walls extending in star patterns that seem almost alien when viewed from above. Official history tells us these were military fortifications built during the gunpowder age, designed to deflect cannon fire and provide overlapping fields of defensive fire. But when we examine these structures against the military explanation, the theory doesn't hold. Here are 4 examples that reveal what star forts truly were. First, consider the global distribution pattern. Star forts appear on every continent. Europe has hundreds of them. North America has them scattered from Canada to Mexico. South America has them. Africa has them. Asia has them. Australia has them. They share identical geometric proportions, despite being attributed to different cultures, different eras, and different military traditions that supposedly had no contact with each other. The Spanish didn't share military secrets with the Dutch. The Portuguese weren't coordinating fortress design with the Russians, yet the star forts in the Philippines match the star forts in Finland. The geometry in Brazil mirrors the geometry in Belgium. The mathematical precision is identical across oceans and centuries. Military architecture evolves based on local conditions, available materials, and specific defensive needs. We would expect to see regional variation if these were truly independent military constructions. Instead, we see uniformity. We see a global template being applied across all inhabited regions. We see evidence of a coordinated infrastructure project, not random military engineering arriving at identical solutions independently. Second, examine the cymatic resonance design. Cymatics is the study of visible sound and vibration. When sound frequencies pass through matter, whether sand, water, or other mediums, they generate geometric patterns, star patterns, hexagonal patterns, complex symmetrical shapes that mirror exactly what we see in star fort layouts. Star forts aren't shaped like military weapons. They're shaped like energy collectors. The geometry isn't optimized for cannon deflection. It's optimized for resonance. The proportions match frequencies. The angles correspond to harmonic relationships that appear throughout nature and throughout the forbidden knowledge traditions described in ancient texts. These structures weren't designed to keep enemies out. They were designed to channel energy in. The star shape collects and focuses electromagnetic frequencies in the same way a satellite dish focuses radio waves. Scale up the principle, and you have the star fort. The Watchers of First Enoch taught humanity the secrets of enchantment and the movements of celestial bodies. Cymatic principles connect sound, geometry, and energy in ways that modern science acknowledges but rarely integrates. Star forts represent the physical application of this forbidden knowledge. Energy infrastructure disguised as military architecture. Third, look at the placement of star forts relative to water sources and ley lines. Nearly every star fort sits near a significant water source. Rivers, lakes, coastal areas, confluences where multiple waterways meet. The consistency of this placement far exceeds what military necessity would require. Water conducts energy. Ancient traditions across cultures recognized water as a carrier of spiritual and electromagnetic force. The placement of star forts at water nodes suggests they were designed to tap into natural energy flows rather than merely defend territory. Additionally, researchers have mapped star fort locations against ley lines, the hypothesized paths of Earth energy that connect sacred sites around the world. The correlation is striking. Star forts cluster along these energy pathways with a consistency that random military placement would never produce. Gilgal Rephaim in Israel, the Wheel of Giants, sits at a ley line intersection. The pyramids of Giza align with global energy patterns. Stone circles throughout Britain mark ley line nodes. Star forts follow the same placement logic. They weren't positioned for strategic military advantage. They were positioned for energetic advantage, for collection, for transmission, for connection to the global grid that powered the pre-Mudflood civilization. Finally, consider the buried and hidden star forts. Many star forts have been buried, filled in, or built over so completely that their existence is only visible from aerial photography or satellite imagery. In some cases, entire cities were constructed inside the boundaries of abandoned star forts without modern residents having any awareness of what lies beneath their streets. The concealment was deliberate. If star forts were merely obsolete military installations, there would be no need to hide them. We don't bury old castles. We don't conceal ancient walls. We preserve them as historical monuments, tourist attractions, educational sites. But star forts have been systematically obscured, filled with dirt, covered with buildings, erased from maps and local memory. This treatment mirrors how the pre-Mudflood civilization itself was hidden. The same forces that buried the buildings buried the energy infrastructure. The same powers that suppressed the historical record suppressed knowledge of how that infrastructure functioned. The concealment of star forts wasn't neglect or urban development. It was evidence disposal. Star forts weren't military architecture. They were the nodes of a global energy grid. Infrastructure built by a civilization that had access to forbidden knowledge, knowledge passed down from the rebellious sons of God who first corrupted humanity before the flood of Noah. This infrastructure had to be buried, destroyed, or disguised after the Mudflood reset because it represented power that the emerging authorities couldn't allow humanity to access. But the Mudflood didn't just bury buildings and infrastructure. It eliminated populations, and the evidence of how humanity was repopulated after this catastrophe points to one of the darkest aspects of the reset. If the Mudflood wiped out a global civilization, what happened to the people who lived in it? Where did the populations that now inhabit these cities come from? The evidence points to a systematic repopulation operation, a coordinated effort to fill emptied cities with new inhabitants who had no memory of what came before. Here are 4 examples that reveal how this reset was carried out. First, the orphan trains of America. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 250,000 children were transported across North America on what became known as orphan trains. These children were gathered from cities on the East Coast and shipped westward to new families in rural communities throughout the Midwest and beyond. The official narrative presents this as a charitable response to urban poverty. Too many orphans in overcrowded cities. Kind-hearted reformers finding them homes in wholesome farming communities. But the scale demands closer examination. 250,000 children. Their origins largely untraceable. Their family histories lost or deliberately obscured. Many of these children had no documentation of parents' birthplaces or previous lives. They were given new names, new histories, new identities that severed any connection to whatever came before. Genesis 9:1 records God's command to Noah after the flood, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth." After divine judgment depopulates a region, repopulation follows. The orphan trains fit this pattern exactly. Children with erased pasts distributed across a landscape that needed inhabitants, not organic population growth over generations. Deliberate redistribution of human resources to fill emptied territories. Second, the European foundling crisis of the 19th century. Across Europe, foundling asylums were overwhelmed with children during the 1800s. London's Foundling Hospital processed an estimated 4,500 infants. Italy saw over 30,000 abandoned babies annually by the 1850s. Spain and Portugal Each reported 15,000 foundlings per year. France, Germany, Russia, all documented unprecedented numbers of children appearing without parents, without histories, without explanations. The official narrative blames poverty and moral decay. Desperate mothers abandoning children they couldn't feed. But poverty had existed for millennia without producing foundling crises of this magnitude. The numbers don't represent gradual social problems. They represent sudden massive displacement of children from their origins. Gros-Île in Quebec typically processed about 10 orphans per year. In 1847, they were overwhelmed with hundreds in a single month, and by year's end, thousands had arrived. The timeline matches the Mudflood window. The scale suggests catastrophe, not poverty. The global synchronization of these foundling crises across Europe and North America points to a coordinated event followed by coordinated response. Third, examine the empty city photographs. Early photographs of major cities around the world share a disturbing characteristic. The streets are nearly devoid of people. Moscow, Paris, San Francisco, St. Petersburg. Grand boulevards stretching between magnificent buildings with barely a human figure visible. Official explanations cite long exposure, times that blurred moving subjects out of the image. But this doesn't fully account for what we're seeing. Long exposure times would capture anyone who stood still for more than a few seconds. We should see people in doorways, at windows, seated on benches. We should see the normal patterns of urban life frozen in place. Instead, we see emptiness, cities that appear recently cleared rather than fully inhabited, landscapes that look like the aftermath of evacuation rather than thriving metropolitan centers. The few people who do appear in these photographs often seem out of place. Poorly dressed figures standing before palatial architecture, small groups clustered in corners of vast empty plazas. The demographic mismatch between the magnificence of the buildings and the apparent poverty of their inhabitants suggests these populations arrived after the buildings existed rather than constructing them. Finally, consider the mass immigration waves of the mid to late 19th century. The Great Migration brought millions of settlers to America, Australia, and other former territories during this period. Official history presents this as opportunity seeking, people fleeing poverty and oppression in Europe to build new lives in lands of promise. But what were they actually arriving to? Settlers didn't build San Francisco's grand Victorian architecture. They moved into it. Homesteaders didn't construct the elaborate buildings that photographs show already standing in frontier towns. They occupied structures that preceded them. The immigrants weren't pioneers building civilization from scratch. They were the repopulation force, filling cities that had been emptied by catastrophe and needed new inhabitants. The timing of mass immigration aligns precisely with the Mudflood window. The destinations were regions showing evidence of burial and abandonment. The schedule was sufficient to repopulate entire continents within a few generations. This wasn't organic migration driven by individual choices. This was managed redistribution of human populations to territories that needed to be refilled. The post-Mudflood repopulation wasn't natural growth over centuries. It was a coordinated operation to fill emptied cities with people who had no memory of what came before. The children's identities were erased. The immigrants' knowledge of their destinations was limited. Everyone who arrived after the reset believed they were building something new rather than inheriting something ancient. But repopulating the earth wasn't enough for the forces that emerged after the mudflood. They had to ensure that no one would ever remember what came before. And the evidence of that memory erasure program is still visible for those who know where to look. The physical evidence could be buried under mud. The populations could be replaced with people who had no connection to the past. But what about those who survived? What about the individuals who remembered the world before the reset? What about the knowledge that persisted despite the catastrophe? The evidence shows a systematic program to erase memory itself. Let's examine 4 specific mechanisms that reveal the scope of this operation. The asylum explosion of the 19th century represents one of the most disturbing aspects of the post-mudflood cover-up. Prior to the 1800s, institutions for the mentally ill were relatively rare. Most communities cared for troubled individuals within families or local arrangements. But suddenly, in the decades following the mudflood window, massive asylum construction projects began across Europe and North America. Enormous institutions capable of housing thousands of patients appeared in virtually every major region. The official narrative presents this as progress. Enlightened society finally addressing mental illness with proper medical facilities. Humanitarian reform replacing neglect with professional care. But the timing is suspicious. The scale is unprecedented. And survivor accounts from these institutions tell a different story. Many asylum inmates weren't mentally ill in any conventional sense. They simply remembered things differently. They spoke of a world that didn't match the emerging official narrative. They asked questions that couldn't be answered. They refused to accept histories that contradicted their own experiences. Institutionalization silenced them. Treatments designed to alter consciousness erased their memories. By the time patients were released, if they were ever released, their testimony had been rendered unreliable. Who believes the ravings are of asylum inmates? The asylums weren't hospitals. They were containment facilities for inconvenient witnesses. Next, consider the systematic alteration of maps during the 19th century. We've already discussed how Tartaria vanished from cartography between the 1700s and mid-1800s, but the map changes went far beyond removing one empire. Coastlines shifted, islands appeared and disappeared, rivers changed course, mountain ranges moved. The geographic record was comprehensively rewritten. Old maps from before 1800 show features that don't exist today. California depicted as an island, land masses in the Pacific that appear on no modern chart. Arctic regions with different configurations than current geography reflects. The standard explanation is that early cartographers made errors that were later corrected as exploration improved. But these weren't random errors by isolated mapmakers. These were consistent features appearing across multiple maps from different countries over centuries. Either dozens of independent cartographers made identical mistakes for 300 years, or the geography itself was changed and the maps were updated to reflect a new reality. The mudflood didn't just bury buildings. It may have reshaped the physical landscape, and the map alterations ensured that no record of the previous configuration would survive. The library fires of the 19th century eliminated written records that might have preserved pre-mudflood knowledge. We touched on this earlier, but the pattern deserves closer examination. Major archives across the world suffered catastrophic fires During the decades following the Mudflood, the Library of Congress in 1851, collections throughout Europe at various points, private libraries, university archives, church records. The losses were global, synchronized, and targeted at precisely the kinds of documents that would have preserved historical memory. Much like the burning of the Library of Alexandria, which eliminated knowledge that threatened emerging Roman and Christian orthodoxies, the 19th century archive fires served ideological purposes. They weren't accidents, they were operations, evidence disposal on a civilizational scale. Whatever survived the Mudflood itself was systematically destroyed in the decades that followed. The written record that remains has been carefully curated. What we're allowed to know has been selected from what once existed. The gaps in our historical knowledge aren't random degradation. They're the scars of deliberate excision. Finally, examine how history itself was restructured through what researchers call the new chronology problem. Anatoly Fomenko, a Russian mathematician, has documented extensive evidence suggesting that conventional historical timelines contain massive errors or deliberate falsifications. Events dated to ancient periods may have actually occurred in medieval or even modern times. Entire centuries may have been fabricated to push certain events further into the past than they actually occurred. This isn't fringe speculation from amateurs. Fomenko holds positions at respected academic institutions. His mathematical analysis of astronomical data in historical records reveals inconsistencies that conventional dating cannot explain. The timeline we accept as fixed may be a construction, a narrative framework imposed on events to serve particular purposes. Daniel 7:25 speaks of one who would think to change times and laws. The manipulation of chronology is the ultimate memory erasure. If you control when events happened, you control what they mean. If you can push the pre-Mudflood civilization back into ancient history, you sever any connection between modern populations and their actual ancestors. The reset becomes invisible because the timeline itself has been restructured to hide it. The memory erasure program operated on every level. Witnesses were institutionalized, maps were redrawn, records were burned, chronology was manipulated. By the time a generation had passed, no one remained who could testify to what the world had been before. The repopulated masses inherited a fabricated history that severed them from the truth of their own past. But the influence of the rebellious sons of God who corrupted the pre-Mudflood civilization didn't end with the reset. Their spiritual legacy continues to shape our world in ways most people never recognize. Just as the Nephilim's influence didn't end with Noah's flood, the spiritual forces behind the pre-Mudflood civilization continue to operate in our world today. The rebellious sons of God don't simply vanish when their physical kingdoms fall. Their influence persists through subtler channels, through secret knowledge passed down to initiates, through organizations that preserve forbidden teachings, through ongoing suppression of truths that would threaten their control. Here are 4 examples that demonstrate this continuing spiritual legacy. The architecture of power in the modern world bears unmistakable marks of pre-Mudflood symbolism and design. Look at Washington, D.C. The city layout incorporates pentagrams, obelisks, and dome structures that mirror the energy harvesting architecture we've discussed. The Capitol building itself features a dome that matches the proportions of pre-Mudflood power stations. The Washington Monument is an Egyptian obelisk, a form that appears throughout Nephilim-influenced civilizations as an energy transmission device. Masonic temples worldwide incorporate the same geometric principles. Corporate headquarters display the same symbolism. Financial centers feature the same architectural elements. This isn't coincidence or aesthetic preference. The knowledge of how to build energy harvesting structures wasn't lost in the Mudflood. It was preserved by select groups who understood its value and kept it hidden from the general population. The free energy technology that once powered a global civilization is still being used, but it's being used privately by those who inherited the forbidden knowledge, while the masses pay for metered electricity generated through controlled scarcity. The architecture reveals who possesses the ancient secrets. Second, the occult movements that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries explicitly claim to recover ancient wisdom. Theosophy, Thelema, the Golden Dawn, Rosicrucianism. These organizations present themselves as repositories of knowledge that predates recorded history. They speak of lost civilizations, hidden masters, forbidden teachings, passed down through secret lineages. This is precisely what we would expect if the pre-Mudflood civilization's spiritual corruption survived the reset. The Watchers of First Enoch taught humanity forbidden knowledge before Noah's flood. That knowledge wasn't completely destroyed. It was preserved by those who served the same rebellious spiritual forces. The occult movements of the modern era represent the continuation of that corrupted lineage. They're not discovering ancient wisdom. They're maintaining it, guarding it, dispensing it to carefully selected initiates who will serve the ongoing agenda. Third, the suppression of free energy technology continues with remarkable consistency. Nikola Tesla's work was confiscated. His laboratory was seized. His papers remain classified decades after his death. But Tesla isn't unique. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, inventors who threatened the energy monopoly meet obstacles that seem coordinated rather than coincidental. Stanley Meyer developed a water fuel cell that allegedly could power vehicles using only water. He died suddenly in 1998 under disputed circumstances. His technology has never been commercially developed. Eugene Malove, an advocate for cold fusion research, was murdered in 2004. The case remains officially unsolved. The pattern repeats across decades and continents. Anyone who gets too close to recovering the free energy technology of the pre-Mudflood world faces suppression, discreditation, or worse. The energy monopoly isn't just about profit. It's about control. Free energy would liberate humanity from systems of dependence that keep populations manageable. The same forces that buried the Mudflood civilization's technology continue to guard against its recovery. Finally, Scripture warns us that the conditions of Noah's day will return before the end. Matthew 24:37-39 records Jesus saying that as it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. The same spiritual forces that corrupted the antediluvian world, that rebuilt after the flood, that established the pre-Mudflood civilization we've been examining, are positioning themselves for another attempt. The seed war hasn't ended. It continues through every generation. The rebellious sons of God who sought to corrupt humanity through the Nephilim, who influenced the builders of Babel, who established the civilization buried by the Mudflood, are still working toward their ultimate objective. The forbidden knowledge is being recovered. The technology is being redeveloped. The spiritual corruption is spreading through channels that most people don't recognize. Understanding the Mudflood isn't just about historical curiosity. It's about recognizing patterns that repeat. It's about identifying the spiritual forces that have worked against humanity since the beginning. It's about preparing for what Scripture tells us is coming. The Mudflood was judgment, but it wasn't the final judgment. The same corruption that brought divine intervention then is building toward another crisis now. Now let's examine how all of these pieces connect through patterns that span continents and centuries, revealing the true scope of what was buried and what continues to operate beneath the surface of our sanitized official history. One of the more fascinating aspects of pre-Mudflood architecture is its alignment with celestial events. Across different regions and supposedly different eras, we find structures intentionally positioned according to the movements of the sun, moon, stars, and planets. This wasn't decoration or coincidence. It was precision engineering designed for specific spiritual and energetic purposes. The patterns connect sites that official history insists had no contact with each other, revealing a global coordination that the mainstream narrative cannot explain. Consider the cathedral alignments of Europe. Churches and cathedrals throughout the continent are positioned so that their main axes align with sunrise on specific feast days. The orientation isn't random. It's calculated to channel solar energy through windows and doorways at precise moments during the liturgical calendar. Chartres Cathedral, Notre Dame, Canterbury, each one positioned according to astronomical principles that mirror far older traditions. These same alignment patterns appear at Stonehenge, where the summer solstice sunrise penetrates to the heart of the monument. They appear at the pyramids of Giza, which align with Orion's belt and track celestial movements with mathematical precision. They appear at Angkor Wat in Cambodia, designed to mirror constellations and mark equinoxes. Cultures that supposedly had no contact with each other, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years according to official chronology, all building according to identical celestial principles. The pre-Mudflood structures we find buried beneath modern cities follow these same alignment patterns. The Kazan Kremlin in Russia features towers aligned with summer and winter solstices. Government buildings in Washington, D.C. incorporate astronomical orientations that mirror ancient temple complexes. The consistency suggests shared knowledge, shared sources, a common origin for architectural principles that appear worldwide. The watchers described in 1st Enoch taught humanity the movements of celestial bodies. Their forbidden knowledge of astronomical cycles and their spiritual significance appears wherever Nephilim influence touched human civilization. The alignment patterns aren't aesthetic choices. They're functional applications of that forbidden knowledge, designed to harness cosmic energies through architectural precision. The cross-cultural architectural fingerprint extends beyond celestial alignment. The same building techniques, the same mathematical proportions, the same decorative motifs appear across civilizations that official history insists developed independently. Gothic cathedrals in Europe, domed mosques in Asia, neoclassical government buildings in America. The official explanation is parallel development, different cultures independently discovering the same principles, but the precision is too exact. The proportions match too perfectly. The mathematical relationships are identical down to decimal points that couldn't arise from independent discovery. Pyramidal structures in Kazakhstan display the same geometric ratios as the pyramids of Egypt. The engineering precision matches. The astronomical alignments match. The construction techniques, insofar as we can determine them, match. These sites are separated by thousands of miles across different terrain, different climates, different supposedly isolated cultures. Yet they share what can only be called a common architectural DNA. The mausoleum of Khoja Ahmed Yasawi in Kazakhstan rivals Egyptian construction in its precision and sophistication. The domed structures of Central Asia mirror the domed structures of Eastern Europe, mirror the domed structures of the Mediterranean. The star forts of the Netherlands match the star forts of the Philippines, match the star forts of Brazil. The global standardization points to a global civilization operating from a unified knowledge base. That knowledge base originated with the forbidden teachings the Watchers brought to humanity. Architecture that channels energy. Geometry that resonates with cosmic frequencies. Building techniques that transcend what human knowledge alone could achieve. The cross-cultural fingerprint is the fingerprint of the rebellious sons of God, visible in every structure they influenced. Cymatic principles appear throughout pre-Mudflood architecture in ways that modern science is only beginning to understand. Cymatics demonstrates that sound frequencies create geometric patterns in physical matter. Sand on a vibrating plate arranges itself into star shapes, hexagonal grids, and complex symmetrical forms depending on the frequency applied. The patterns are reproducible, predictable, and mathematical. Pre-Mudflood buildings incorporate these same patterns in their design. Cathedral rose windows display cymatic geometries. Floor mosaics reproduce frequency patterns. The proportions of chambers and halls correspond to acoustic resonances that would generate specific effects on human consciousness. These buildings weren't just visually beautiful. They were functional instruments designed to manipulate frequency, vibration, and energy. The pipe organs found in cathedrals weren't merely musical instruments. They generated frequencies that interacted with the architecture itself, creating resonance effects throughout the structure. The bells in Tower Campaniles serve similar functions. Sound as technology, architecture as instrument. The entire building functioning as a device for generating and channeling energetic forces that modern science dismisses as superstition. First, Enoch describes the Watchers teaching the cutting of roots and enchantment. These cryptic phrases may refer to vibrational technologies, techniques for manipulating matter and consciousness through frequency and resonance. Cymatic architecture represents the physical application of these forbidden arts, buildings designed to enchant their occupants through principles that predate modern understanding by millennia. Military symbolism found on surviving artifacts and structures ties the pre-Mudflood civilization explicitly to rebellious spiritual forces. Pentagrams appear on military banners and government buildings. The double-headed eagle, symbol of spiritual and political dominion, was used by rulers across supposedly unconnected empires. Dragon imagery, serpent motifs, and other symbols directly connected to biblical descriptions of Satan and his forces appear throughout the architectural and heraldic records of the pre-Mudflood world. Revelation 12:9 identifies the dragon with Satan himself. dragon imagery on military banners and royal seals represents explicit alignment with that rebellious spiritual power. The civilizations that used these symbols weren't ignorant of their meaning. They were declaring their allegiance. They were marking themselves as servants of the same fallen beings who first corrupted humanity in the garden. The celestial alignments, the cross-cultural fingerprint, the cymatic principles, the military symbolism, all of it connects to form a coherent picture, a global civilization operating on forbidden knowledge, architecture designed to channel energies that modern science refuses to acknowledge, explicit allegiance to spiritual forces that Scripture identifies as enemies of humanity and opponents of Yahweh. This civilization was judged, buried, erased from official memory, but the evidence remains for those willing to see it. So now that we've laid out this evidence, what does it all mean? And more importantly, why does any of this matter now? So now that we've laid out all the evidence, it's clear that the Mudflood wasn't just another natural disaster or geological curiosity. It was part of a larger spiritual war, another intervention by Yahweh against a civilization corrupted by the rebellious sons of God. But here's the thing. This is only the beginning of what we've uncovered. There's so much more that ties into this, whether it's the spiritual battles happening today, how the buried history connects to other ancient events we've explored, or what's coming as the Seed War approaches its final confrontation. Think about what we've discussed. The buried architecture spanning every continent, the World's Fair's deception, hiding pre-existing structures under false construction narratives, the free energy technology suppressed to maintain control over populations, the star-fought energy grid designed to power a global civilization, the repopulation operation that filled emptied cities with people who had no memory of what came before, the systematic erasure of historical records, witnesses, and even the timeline itself. It all points to a civilization that played a crucial role in the spiritual war we're all part of. A civilization that aligned itself with the wrong side. A civilization that was judged, buried, and erased from human memory. But as we've seen, history has been distorted, hidden, deliberately suppressed. And that's why discussions like this are so important. We're piecing together a puzzle that has been deliberately kept from us. Every buried building, every demolished World's Fair structure, every asylum that silenced witnesses, every map that erased Tartaria, every archive that conveniently burned. Each piece reveals more of the picture they don't want us to see. If this resonates with you, if you're someone who loves to dig deeper and uncover hidden truths that the mainstream refuses to acknowledge, you're definitely in the right place. We're building something powerful here, a community of people who want to know the real story, who aren't satisfied with the surface-level answers that authorities hand down, who recognize that the official narratives don't add up and are willing to follow the evidence wherever it leads. The more we share these discoveries, the closer we get to understanding our place in this epic battle that's been raging since the dawn of time. The Seed War didn't end with Noah's flood. It didn't end with Babel. It didn't end with the Mudflood. It continues today, and understanding how previous rounds were fought is essential to recognizing what's happening now. If you found any part of this video eye-opening, if it sparked new questions for you, if it changed how you'll look at that old building downtown or that cathedral you've passed 100 times without really seeing, I encourage you to stay connected. We're just scratching the surface. There's so much more to explore. We've got future videos lined up that dive even deeper into these mysteries, connecting the mudflood to other hidden history that mainstream sources refuse to touch. Trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming. So if you haven't already, I'd love for you to join our community. Just hit that subscribe button below, and if you click the bell, you'll get notified when our next deep dive is ready. That way, you'll be the first to see the latest findings and never miss out on the most important updates. These conversations grow when we share them. If you know someone who's curious about this topic, someone who's already asking questions about the strange architecture in their city, or wondering why official history has so many gaps, feel free to pass this video along. Sharing is how we can continue uncovering the truth together. Finally, I want to hear from you. Your insights, your theories, your questions, they help shape the direction of these discussions. What buried buildings have you noticed in your area? What questions do you have about the evidence we've presented? What nasamon connections are you making to other research you've encountered? Drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. The mudflood buried a civilization, but it couldn't bury the truth forever. The evidence is rising back to the surface, and together, we're the ones digging it out. Thank you for being a part of this journey. I'm excited to see where we go from here. What if I told you that everything you thought you knew about history, about the cities beneath our feet, the cathedrals above our heads, and the civilization that built them has been deliberately hidden from you? Imagine for a moment that there was once an advanced global society so powerful, so technologically sophisticated that its very existence had to be buried literally under layers of mud, dirt, and lies. But what if this buried world wasn't just another lost civilization? What if it was the result of divine judgment, a direct intervention by Yahweh against a society that had fallen under the influence of the rebellious sons of God, aiming to corrupt and control humanity? Once again, we've all heard about mysterious lost civilizations: Atlantis, Lemuria, ancient Egypt. But the mudflood, it's a phenomenon that has sparked endless debate and speculation across the world. Some say it was a random natural disaster, nothing more than geological processes doing what geological processes do. Others claim it was simply urban development, streets being raised over time, old buildings gradually sinking into the earth. But I'm here to tell you that the mudflood wasn't just a geological event. It was something far deeper, something far more ancient, and something that continues to influence our world today. Think about what we've examined together in this video. Across every continent on Earth, we find buildings with their first floors buried underground. Windows that were clearly designed to let in sunlight now opening into dirt. Ornate doorways that once welcomed visitors now sealed beneath street level. Cathedrals with entrances 10 feet below the current ground. Government buildings with elaborate architectural details hidden in what we'd now call basements. And this isn't isolated to one city or one country. We're talking about Seattle, Boston, San Francisco, Moscow, St. Petersburg, Prague, Paris, Melbourne. Cities on opposite sides of the planet showing the exact same pattern of burial. In this video, we uncovered the truth about what lies beneath our cities. We dug beneath the surface quite literally and explored a theory that ties this global catastrophe to one of the oldest and most dangerous conflicts in human history, the Seed War. Yes, the Seed War. A spiritual battle that began in the days of Noah, continued at the Tower of Babel, and stretches all the way to the present day. The Mudflood, I believe, was another front in this ongoing war. A war between Yahweh, the creator of all things, and the rebellious sons of God who sought to corrupt and dominate humanity. And if you thought this was just another video about conspiracy theories, you've seen by now that the evidence points to something much bigger than any one theory can explain. We showed you how the Mudflood fits into the biblical narrative of divine intervention and how it mirrors the same kinds of spiritual judgments that led to Noah's flood, the destruction of Babel, and the annihilation of Sodom and Gomorrah. But even more importantly, we explained why this matters now and how the legacy of this buried civilization, just like the Nephilim, continues to shape our world today through secret societies, suppressed technology, occult practices, and the ongoing deception of humanity. If you're someone who's curious about the hidden truths of history, the spiritual battle shaping our world, and the mysteries that most people are afraid to confront, then you understand why this matters. We walk through undeniable evidence that points to the Mudflood as divine judgment, a deliberate intervention by Yahweh to stop a civilization that had become corrupted by the same fallen beings who corrupted humanity before the Genesis flood. Consider the scope of what we examined. Entire buildings, cathedrals, and palaces, some of which are not even 200 years old, according to official narratives, are provably buried under 14 feet of soil. Entire cities on every continent all over the world. And yet somehow questioning this is considered fringe thinking. Somehow noticing that the first floor of your city's oldest building is underground makes you a conspiracy theorist. But the evidence is right there, visible to anyone willing to look. We examined Seattle's original downtown sitting completely beneath the current street level. You can take tours through what used to be the main thoroughfares of the city, walking past storefronts and doorways that haven't seen natural light in over a century. The official story is that after a fire, the city simply decided to raise itself by an entire story. But we showed you what that actually means, what the logistics require, what the engineering demands, and why there's so little documentation of this massive undertaking. We looked at Boston's historic buildings with their original first floors buried underground, photographs from the 1800s showing these same structures with their ground floors fully exposed, windows at street level, doors opening onto sidewalks. Today those windows look into dirt. Those doors lead nowhere. The buildings haven't sunk. The ground has risen. But risen from what? Filled with what? And documented where? We examined Moscow and the striking photographic evidence showing the city's magnificent architecture standing in landscapes that appear recently devastated. Mud everywhere. Few people visible in the streets. Grand buildings rising from what looks like a construction site or disaster zone rather than an established urban center. The buildings look ancient and magnificent. The surroundings look raw and unsettled, as if the structures were uncovered rather than constructed, as if the populations that now inhabit them arrived after the buildings were already there. We addressed the mainstream explanations, natural disasters, urban development, regional flooding, lost records, and we showed you systematically why none of these explanations hold up, when you compare them to the global evidence, we examined each theory and applied the same rigorous standards that these theories fail to meet. The truth is far more disturbing than the comfortable lies we've been told. The truth points to deliberate action, coordinated burial, systematic erasure, and divine judgment. We examined the world's fairs and their impossible construction timelines, buildings that rivaled ancient Rome, supposedly erected in months, and then demolished immediately after exhibition. We looked at the free energy technology that powered the pre-Mudflood world, technology that's been systematically suppressed ever since by forces that profit from controlled scarcity. We traced the Starfort network spanning every continent, geometric structures designed not for military defense, but for energy collection and transmission. We uncovered the repopulation operation, the orphan trains, the foundling crisis, the mass immigration waves that filled emptied cities with people who had no memory of what came before. We exposed the memory erasure program, the asylums that silenced witnesses, the maps that were redrawn, the archives that were burned, the timeline itself that was restructured to hide the truth. And we showed you how the spiritual forces behind the pre-Mudflood civilization continue to operate today, through architecture that preserves forbidden knowledge, through occult movements that claim ancient wisdom, through ongoing suppression of technologies that would free humanity from control, through preparation for the next phase of the seed war that Scripture tells us is coming. The Mudflood wasn't just a geological event. It was divine judgment against a civilization that had aligned itself with the rebellious sons of God. The same spiritual corruption that brought Noah's flood. The same unified rebellion that built Babel. The same wickedness that consumed Sodom and Gomorrah. Yahweh intervened because the alternative was total corruption of humanity by fallen beings who have sought since the beginning to destroy what God created. The evidence we've presented doesn't just challenge mainstream history. It reveals a pattern that repeats across millennia. Divine judgment when corruption reaches its fullness, reset, repopulation, memory erasure. And then the cycle begins again as the same spiritual forces work to rebuild their corrupted kingdom. Understanding this pattern is essential because Scripture tells us the conditions of Noah's day will return before the end. The same forces that corrupted the antediluvian world, that rebuilt after the flood, that established the civilization buried by the Mudflood, are working now toward their ultimate objective. The seed war hasn't ended. It continues through every generation, and we're living in what may be its final phase. The buried buildings beneath our cities aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence of divine intervention, testimony to Yahweh's faithfulness in protecting humanity from spiritual corruption. Warnings about what happens when civilizations align themselves with the wrong side of the eternal conflict. Every time you walk past an old building with its first floor underground, you're walking past a monument to divine judgment. Every basement window at street level whispers of a world that was buried. Every cathedral with entrances below ground testifies to forces powerful enough to build magnificence and wicked enough to be destroyed. The truth has been buried, but it's rising back to the surface. And now you know what lies beneath. So now that we've laid out all the evidence, it's clear that the Mudflood wasn't just another lost chapter of history. It was part of a larger spiritual war. Another incursion by the rebellious sons of God. Another intervention by Yahweh to stop the corruption before it consumed everything. But here's the thing. This is only the beginning of what we've uncovered. There's so much more that ties into this. Whether it's the spiritual battles happening today, or how the history of the Mudflood connects to other ancient events we've explored. Think about what we've discussed. The architecture, the world's fairs, the free energy technology, the star forts, the repopulation operation, the memory erasure. It all points to a civilization that played a crucial role in the spiritual war we're all a part of. But as we've seen, history has been erased, distorted, or hidden, and that's why discussions like this are so important. We're piecing together a puzzle that has been deliberately kept from us. If this resonates with you, and if you're someone who loves to dig deeper and uncover hidden truths, you're definitely in the right place. We're building something powerful here, a community of people who want to know the real story, who aren't satisfied with the surface level answers. And the more we share these discoveries, the closer we get to understanding our place in this epic battle that's been raging since the dawn of time. If you found any part of this video eye-opening, or if it sparked new questions for you, I encourage you to stay connected. We're just scratching the surface. Now, if you're like me, you're already thinking about the next step in this journey. There's so much more to explore. We've got future videos lined up that dive even deeper into these mysteries. And trust me, you don't want to miss them. So if you haven't already, I'd love for you to join our community. Just hit that subscribe button below. And if you click the bell, you'll get notified when our next deep dive is ready. That way, you will be the first to see the latest findings and never miss out on the most important updates. And remember, these conversations grow when we share them. If you know someone who's curious about this topic or would benefit from hearing a different perspective, feel free to pass this video along. Sharing is how we can continue uncovering the truth together. Finally, I want to hear from you. Your insights, your theories, your questions. They help shape the direction of these discussions. So drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and I'm excited to see where we go from here.